It's a secret to everybody. This is Legendary Adventures, a Legend of Zelda playthrough podcast. This week, I'm revisiting the first game in the series with a look at the development and legacy of The Legend of Zelda. It was developed side by side with another genre-defining work which could in many ways be viewed as the end of an era for Nintendo. That other game is, of course, Super Mario Bros. So why do I say that Super Mario Bros. Could be considered the end of an era? Well, according to Jeremy Parish in his NES Works series, Mario Bros. Was designed to make full use of the stock NES hardware. In a 2005 interview translated by Shmupulations, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto said, "Super Mario Bros. Was actually going to be the final game that we developed for both cart and disc before switching to disk system development entirely. This is true," he said with a laugh. Of course, it would not be the final game on cartridge, but that was the idea. The Legend of Zelda, meanwhile, was going to be one of the first games published for the Famicom disk system. This was an add-on for the Famicom, or Family Computer, the Japanese version of the NES. Disk system games were stored and played off of what were essentially large floppy disks. The change in format allowed Nintendo to offer bigger games at a lower price. It also allowed for more ambitious games like Zelda, with the discs having the ability to write memory and save games. The Legend of Zelda was created and designed by famed game designer Shigeru Miyamoto and his regular collaborator Takashi Tezuka. In a 1994 interview published with The Legend of Zelda Sound and Drama CD, Miyamoto stated the development on the game started in 1984. In an interview promoting the NES Classic Edition in 2016, Miyamoto said, "First we started making The Legend of Zelda. Then we started Super Mario Bros. The Legend of Zelda was for the Family Computer disk system, so we decided to finish up Super Mario Bros. First." In a 2003 interview with Super Play magazine, Miyamoto said that as they worked, they tried to separate the ideas between the two games. They designed Super Mario Bros. To be a linear progressing game, and Zelda to be the complete opposite. In a 1994 interview, Miyamoto said, "We were brimming with new ideas on how to fully utilize the disk system's new capabilities. A name entry system using better music, recording the player's progress, and so forth. In that sense, it was a very fun game to create." In a 2009 Iwata Asks interview, Tezuka noted that early on in development, Miyamoto would write the game specifications on a whiteboard. Then Tezuka and lead programmer Toshiko Nakago would copy down what he wrote onto paper. From there, rough sketches of enemies, traps, and obstacles were drawn up. In a 2003 interview with Super Play magazine, Miyamoto said that while designing the game, he and Tezuka drew inspiration from books, movies, and their own lives. The movies that he credited as inspiration include the two Indiana Jones films released at the time, Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Temple of Doom. He also mentioned Indiana Jones in that NES Classic Edition interview. He said, "We wanted to bring that sense of adventure to a video game. So much so, Adventure was the working title of the game." In that 2009 Iwata Asks interview, Tezuka and Nakago note that Adventure was written on all the design documents. Tezuka says that he believes the binder that held everything together was labeled Adventure Mario. Another influence Miyamoto cited was the surge in popularity for computer role-playing games, where players control swordsmen. In a 1992 interview with a Japanese magazine that was translated by Shmupulations, Miyamoto said, "Back when LOZ was being made, having a world based on swords and magic was still a fresh idea." Additionally, Miyamoto described the experience of exploring fields, forests, and caves near his home in Kyoto as a child as a major source of inspiration for the game. In an interview published in the official guidebook to the Japanese version of A Link to the Past, programmer Yusunari Soejima stated that in the early stages, The Legend of Zelda contained only dungeons. In fact, early plans would have allowed players to design their own dungeons and share them with friends. Dungeons were entered via a dungeon select screen. An early design for the select screen features the text, "You must find circle number 3. Good luck," written in English. The Zelda Encyclopedia features a screenshot of the dungeon select screen actually running on some early version of the game, but that text does not appear. In the introduction to the book Hyrule Historia, Miyamoto wrote, "I thought that we should take advantage of the disk system's ability to rewrite data. by making a game that allowed players to create dungeons, then explore each other's creations. We designed the game, and the overall response was that playing through the dungeons was the best part. When it became clear the dungeon design aspect was going nowhere, the game was reworked to focus on a set single-player experience. After this, the overworld for the game was born. In a guidebook interview, Miyamoto said when they first added the world map, everything was clumped together. As work on the game progressed, the map was expanded. In Hyrule Historia, he wrote, "We made a one-player game with dungeons under mountains that surround Death Mountain. But we couldn't shake that 'I want to play above ground too' feeling. So we added forests, lakes, and eventually Hyrule Field." In the 2009 Iwata Asks interview, Nakago described how Tezuka and Miyamoto designed the world map. He said, "Back then, we had some long paper, and Tezuka-san and Miyamoto-san would sit side by side and draw together. Tezuka was on the left, Miyamoto was on the right. The map is ultimately laid out on an 8x16 grid comprised of 128 screens." In that 1994 interview, Miyamoto said, "I wanted to create a game where the player could experience the feeling of exploration as he travels about the world, becoming familiar with the history of the land and the natural world he inhabits. That is reflected in the title, The Legend of Blank." In Hyrule Historia, Miyamoto explained how they filled in that blank in the title. He said, "I knew I wanted it to be the legend of something, but I had a hard time figuring out what that something was going to be. That's when the PR planner said, 'Why don't you make a storybook for this game?' He suggested an illustrated story where Link rescues a princess who is a timeless beauty with classic appeal, and mentioned, 'There's a famous American author whose wife's name is Zelda. How about giving that name to the eternal beauty?' I couldn't get behind the book idea, but I really liked the name Zelda. I asked him if I could use it, and he said that would be fine." When it came to the player's avatar, Link, Miyamoto told French magazine Game Cult in 2012 that he and Tezuka wanted a recognizable character. He said Tezuka drew the sprite. Miyamoto said he wanted him to have a big weapon for it to be easily distinguishable. He said, "The next step was to create a hero that could be distinguished from these weapons despite its small size. So we thought of a long hat with big ears. It reminded us of a fairy character, so we set off in the direction of an elf. At the time, whoever said character with pointy ears also said Peter Pan. And since I really like Disney, we started to be inspired by it. Not completely, of course, otherwise it wouldn't have been great. From there, I thought Peter Pan's green was a perfect fit for him. However, since we were limited to 3 colors, there were a lot of forest environments in the game, green on green. It was pretty suitable, so we continued with it." When asked about where Link's name came from, Miyamoto said, "When we started designing The Legend of Zelda, we imagined the fragments of the Triforce would actually be electronic chips. I had a video game that would be set in both the past and the future. As the hero made the link between one and the other, it was called Link. But in the end, Link never went to the future, and it remained a heroic fantasy game. One other important character to the game only appears in the pages of the manual, Zelda's maid Impa. In Hyrule Historia, Miyamoto said, her name comes from the word impart. Impa is said to be the source of many of the hints offered in the game manual and the map included with the game. Miyamoto said, Impa, Link, and Zelda were the guardians of the Triforce. Today, when you think of the characters who are connected to the Triforce, you think of Link, Zelda, and Ganon. But that started in Ocarina of Time. Originally, Ganon was only a villain in relentless pursuit of the Triforce. The dungeons were laid out by Tezuka. The 2009 Iwata Asks interview includes drawings showing how the dungeons were designed to fit together across a 128-screen grid like a jigsaw puzzle. The first dungeons fit together like a puzzle and fill one 128-screen grid. The final 3 also fit together to fill a second. Tezuka said he designed the dungeons that way in order to get as many of them in the game as possible, with the limited memory available to them. Funnily enough, Tezuka was a little too good at saving space. In that Iwata Asks interview, Nakago said that after laying out the dungeons following the plans given to him by Tezuka, only half of the available memory was used. With a full half of available memory left, they designed a second quest. The second quest includes a set of 9 new extra challenging dungeons. The locations of the dungeons on the overworld are also shuffled around. It's an extra challenge for fans who really get into the game. I personally have never completed the second quest. It is accessed by completing the game or by players entering the name Zelda for their link when they start a new file. The music for The Legend of Zelda was composed by Koji Kondo. He famously pulled an all-nighter arranging and programming the title screen theme. In a 2016 interview for the NES Classic, Kondo said the original plan was to use a piece of classical music for the title screen, Bolero by Maurice Ravel. At the last minute, however, they discovered that piece was still under copyright. Miyamoto states the copyright was set to expire soon after the game's release, perhaps as soon as 1 month. But because the game was set to launch with the Famicom Disk System, Miyamoto said they could not delay the release. The result is that Kondo created a new arrangement of the overworld music for the title screen. It's often stated that Kondo wrote that particular piece in its entirety when he discovered Bolero could not be used, but in the interview, Kondo stated it was already in the game. The title screen music differs in that it features an extended introduction and a slower pace. Most, if not all of the music contained in the game has appeared in later games in the series. That includes the title theme, the dungeon theme, the theme for Death Mountain, and various jingles from collecting items to discovering secrets. This game ranks among Kondo's best known and best loved work. The original Legend of Zelda is famously obtuse. The game manual included with the original game is pretty much essential to play. It offers a variety of hints and even gives a detailed guide on how to reach the first dungeon. The game's attract screen also includes a message to read the manual. In the interview for the NES Classic, Miyamoto said, "One function of the booklet was to reinforce the feeling of the game's epic setting. Additionally, a lot of people would be playing an adventure game of that type for the first time, so the booklet would serve to provide instructions." In North America, the game also came with a printed map. It included a variety of hints printed along the sides and clearly marked the location of the first 4 dungeons. However, 30 of the game's 128 screens were left blank for players to fill in themselves. According to an article on shacknews.com, Miyamoto did not initially want to include the map. It appears a compromise was reached, with Miyamoto stating the map was sealed with a message saying, "You should only use the map and the strategic tips as a last resort." The Legend of Zelda released in Japan in February 1986. It would arrive in North America and PAL regions the following year. It was a critical and commercial success. According to themagicbox.com, the game sold 6.51 million copies. That places it in the top 10 best-selling NES games and made it the best-selling Legend of Zelda release until the release of Ocarina of Time in 1998. With the success of The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo quickly began to work on sequels, and the series is recognized as one of the company's flagship series. It now spans more than 20 games. The Legend of Zelda also spawned a number of imitators. As mentioned earlier, in Japan, the game was a launch title for the Famicom Disk System. Outside of Japan, The Legend of Zelda was released on cartridge through the use of more advanced chips and a battery-powered backup for save games. The battery keeps the temporary memory of the game active, allowing the game to be saved as long as the battery has power. In his NES Works series, Jeremy Parish notes, "The Legend of Zelda wasn't the first game to use a battery backup. He names at least one other game that predated it, but he noted that it's widely considered as the first major release to include one, and it helped popularize the practice." Following the release of Zelda, battery backups would become more common in cartridge-based games, before eventually being replaced with external memory cards, and ultimately consoles with built-in hard drives. The Legend of Zelda also became a major pillar in open-world game design. Open world games are defined by game designer John Harris as titles where players are generally left to their own devices to explore a large world. In a 2007 article for what was then named Gamasutra but is now Game Developer, Harris cited Atari's Adventure, Grand Theft Auto, Metroid, and Zelda as open-world titles. He specifically cited the Zelda titles Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker, but those games owe much of their DNA to this original game. And others, such as Game Informer's Kyle Hilliard and YouTuber Stuart Brown of the channel Ahoy, list The Legend of Zelda among examples of early open-world games. Now, I know there will be some disagreement with me on this, but I argue that open-world games are not a genre unto themselves. To me, the term open world is instead a modifier that explains the format of the game. Open world games can be action games, RPGs, platformers, driving games, and more. What open world games have in common is an interconnected world map, and gameplay that encourages a degree of exploration of that map. Levels are not selected from a menu or presented as self-contained individual experiences with clear beginnings and ends, like you might see in games like Super Mario Bros. Instead, the levels are integrated into the world. Players find and access them by traveling to them. Remember, the original Super Mario Bros. Was designed to be the opposite of Zelda. While it features occasional cutscenes that show how the stages are connected together, each stage is nonetheless a single contained area, clearly separated and distinct from the others. Future games in the Super Mario Bros. Series, like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, feature interconnected world maps. But those maps are still just meant to connect distinct contained levels, which have obstacles that reset every time the stages enter. The distinction between Mario and Zelda was reduced somewhat over the years, and the developers acknowledged this during the development of Ocarina of Time. Titles like Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Odyssey all feature large stages with an emphasis on exploration. I personally would not consider them open world because they still have distinct stages that are generally selected from a menu, but I know many would disagree with me, including the developers of those games. Articles about open world titles will often mention Super Mario 64, and in a 2011 Iwata Asks interview, Nintendo designer Yoshiaki Koizumi was asked about working on both Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. He responded, "They both fell into the category of 3D open world action games. I really didn't see a difference between them." But I digress. While exploration is a big part of open world gaming, it does not mean that players have no direction. Within The Legend of Zelda itself, players are given hints of locations to travel to. An open world does not mean there will be no dead ends either. In addition to the bounds that are at the edge of the game world, players will run into areas that are locked in some way. These locks are used by the developers to prevent, or at least discourage, players from venturing into certain parts of the map before the developer wants them to. Throughout my podcast, I have referred to these as soft locks and hard locks. I may not have completely thought those terms through, but this far into the podcast and after hearing someone else pick up the term as I use them in connection to Zelda, I'm just going to keep using them. A hard lock requires players to use a particular item, such as a literal key, weapon, or new ability to pass through. Areas locked by certain story beats would also be considered hard locked. A soft lock is designed to repel the player, but these locks can be bypassed if the player has the proper knowledge or skill. Within the original Legend of Zelda, hard locks include the raft docks, the requirement to have the whistle to enter level 7, or the candle to enter level 8, and the Triforce to tackle level 9. Soft locks are seen in areas like the Lost Woods, which lock a full third of the map, and the Lost Hills, which locks access to level 5. These areas are designed to make it unlikely for a player to find their way through on their own, but once the player learns the secret to passing through them, they can pass through at any time. Hard locks and soft locks are common features throughout open world games. There's a notion that's risen in recent years that the Legend of Zelda series was not open world until Breath of the Wild. We can see with this first game, and I believe most, if not all, of the subsequent games that this is not the case. The reasoning behind deeming Breath of the Wild open world versus other games generally seems to boil down to how these hard and soft locks are implemented. I see commentators often saying that Breath of the Wild has no locks. That's not true. The game has both hard locks and soft locks. We can see hard locks like at the beginning of the game where players are limited to the Great Plateau until they acquire the glider, or players being barred from Gerudo Town until they have the proper clothes to disguise themselves as a woman. We can also see a number of soft locks in locations like the Lost Woods and Zora's Domain. Now, that's not to say that Breath of the Wild and the original game feature the same structure. They don't. Breath of the Wild is a much more loosely structured game in terms of the requirements to complete the game than any other Zelda game that came before it. My point is that a loose structure or a lack of structure is not the definition of open world, and that the inclusion of hard locks and soft locks does not exclude a game from being open world. We can see that not only by considering all Zelda titles, but also other games designed in an open world style. We'll explore the structure of Breath of the Wild more when we get there. I just feel it's important to establish the meaning of open world now because I disagree with the notion that somehow Zelda titles are not open world. I feel The Legend of Zelda also established the core gameplay elements that define the series. Zelda fans will often discuss the Zelda formula, a common structure of the series. When it's discussed, I often hear commentators describe elements from A Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time, including things like a dual world, a 2x structure, and the Master Sword. These are featured in a number of games in the series, but certainly not all. I personally believe that the true Zelda formula that defines the mainline titles can be found in the very first game. It comes down in part to genre. This is an occasionally thorny discussion among video game fans, as genres are often defined by the type of play rather than the mood or the setting. Over the years, many gameplay elements from various video game genres have been blended together. The Legend of Zelda itself is a game that blended genre elements at the time of its release. I'll do my best to define what I mean when I describe the genre of The Legend of Zelda and similar games. At the time of its release, and for many years afterwards, Zelda was described as a role-playing game. These are video games inspired by Dungeons & Dragons and similar tabletop games. It's easy to see how Zelda draws from the RPG tradition in simplified ways. Players can name Link whatever they desire. Link can also improve his stats, but not through the collection of experience points, but rather through the collection of equipment and heart containers. However, the equipment is more limited and is permanently applied once collected. Zelda also has a distinct focus on action. I personally would say that the original Legend of Zelda was on the leading edge of a trend to incorporate RPG elements into action-oriented games, a trend that continues today. In The Legend of Zelda, players fight enemies in real time. They have to dodge attacks while landing attacks of their own. In some cases, this requires quick movements on the part of the player to avoid taking damage. There are also elements that are closer to arcade titles, such as the collectible stopwatches that temporarily stop all enemies on screen. Combat challenges are also essential to the game, with dungeons regularly featuring screens which must be cleared in order to progress. Zelda also draws elements from adventure games. The adventure game genre started as text-based games on PCs, and they got their name from the very first of these games, the Colossal Cave Adventure. Later adventure games would introduce point-and-click interfaces. The genre has a distinct focus on story and puzzles. In adventure games, puzzles generally revolve around the collection of inventory items, and we can see the adventure game influence on Zelda with the various tools that Link collects throughout the game, and the riddle-like hints offered by the old men and women in the game. In an interview for the Japanese Player Guide for A Link to the Past, Takashi Tezuka said of the original Legend of Zelda, "We basically decided to do a real-time adventure game. No one wants to do physical things like pushing and pulling by selecting them from a menu. If they're going to push something, they want to put some force behind it." Let's touch on just a few examples of the adventure game mentality within The Legend of Zelda. Bombs are one example, using items to solve puzzles, such as defeating Dodongo, using the map and bombs together in level 5 to find the path forward. Adventure games also feature pretty heavily in level 7's design. Players are offered a riddle to solve in order to find the dungeon. An item, the whistle, is required to reveal the dungeon. It also features the Hungry Goria puzzle, which is a true adventure game style puzzle involving the use of an item. While The Legend of Zelda was primarily defined as an RPG at the time of its release, today I think it would be more readily defined as an action-adventure series. The real-time combat, the dodging of enemies and traps, comes straight from action games, while the puzzle solving and interactions with non-player characters and the distinct focus on inventory items come from the adventure game tradition. That said, RPG elements remain even to this day. In the Link to the Past Player's Guide interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said, "It has everything that's good about an RPG. It's interesting to hear my players bragging about how they got this armor and that tunic, so they don't take damage. It means they're really attached to their character. That's why I wanted them to choose their own name." So, all of that said, how would I define the Zelda formula? I would say that Zelda games are open-world action-adventure games. Each game features a main quest, which revolves around collecting plot-relevant items or MacGuffins from dungeons. Each dungeon will feature a tool, or a dungeon item, that will grant players more abilities, and that some of those tools will open more of the world map. Dungeons will also award players with a heart container, generally after the boss is defeated. That, in my opinion, is the big strokes picture of the Zelda formula. This game also defines a number of smaller game mechanics that are used throughout the series. Real nitty-gritty stuff, which are carried over to most, but not all titles in the series. That includes Link's health being represented by hearts, those hearts being restored through the collection of recovery heart items. The game also introduces fairies, which restore health, great fairies, which are hidden on the world map in portions to restore health. There's also an assignable button, which is how players will use the items that Link collects. And on top of that, it establishes rupees as the currency of the Zelda series, though the rupee values and colors aren't set yet. This is all tied together by a story that lays the groundwork for the larger series. The story and the lore of the Kingdom of Hyrule, the Magical Triforce, Ganon, Link, and Zelda are all pretty sketchy and not defined at this point. It is, however, the jumping off point to larger stories, and now a truly complex game lore that fans love poring over and theorizing about. That's it for this episode of Legendary Adventures Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week I'm going to go through my playthrough of The Legend of Zelda, and we'll take a closer look at the world of the game. If you want to follow along, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you. You're awesome. I'm Paul Riley, and I'll see you next week.